Turn again with me now in the Word of God to 1 Kings chapter 22. 1 Kings chapter 22. And our lesson begins this morning with verse 41. Our text this morning brings us to one of the most interesting of the kings that sat upon the throne in the southern half of the divided kingdom, Judah. His name is well known, Jehoshaphat. His name is well known to saved people, of course, but his name is also well known even among the unsaved, made popular by a comic strip character who used to say, "Jumpin' Jehoshaphat." So his name is someone that we have heard of. But for us who are saved, we have this man set before us for very specific reasons. We were introduced to him earlier in our study, particularly in the dealings that he had with King Ahab, as recorded in the first 40 verses of this chapter. And we already know of Jehovah's protection over him and his delivering him from death at the hands of the Arameans when he foolishly followed Ahab's instruction and wore his royal robes into battle. But there is much more for us to learn about this man, even from this brief account that is set before us. And as we look into these few verses, may God give us understanding, the understanding that we desperately need, especially as to the applications for our own lives. So follow with me as I read, beginning with verse 41 of chapter 22. And Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa, began to reign over Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, king of Israel. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 25 years in Jerusalem. And his mother's name was Asubah, the daughter of Shilil. And he walked in all the ways of Asa his father. He turned not aside from it, doing that which was right in the eyes of the Lord. Nevertheless, the high places were not taken away, for the people offered and burnt incense yet in the high places. And Jehoshaphat made peace with the king of Israel. Now the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat and his might that he showed and how he warred, are they not written in the books of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? And the remnant of the Sodomites, which remained in the days of his father Asa, he took out of the land. There was then no king in Edom. A deputy was king. Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold, but they went not, for the ships were broken at Ezion-Geber. Then said Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, unto Jehoshaphat, Let my servants go with thy servants in the ships. But Jehoshaphat would not. And Jehoshaphat slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David his father. And Jehoram his son reigned in his stead. We have for the past several weeks been looking at the reign of Ahab in the northern part of the divided kingdom, Israel. Now we come to the reign of Jehoshaphat in Judah. Our coverage begins with general statements, statements of general facts concerning him that begin in verse 41. A much fuller account is given of this man in 2 Kings chapter 3 and again in 2 Chronicles chapters 17, 18, 19, and 20. But we're going to confine ourselves to what we have before us this morning in 1 Kings. The first thing we see about him is his name. Verse 41, and Jehoshaphat, the son of Asa. Jehoshaphat is from a combination of two Hebrew words, Jehovah and Shaphat. Jehoshaphat means Jehovah judges, or Jehovah the judge. It's a very special name and has special emphasis, particularly at that time in the history of the nation. It was a name that put great weight upon the bearer of it. And it was a hard task for Jehoshaphat to live according to that name. We see his ascension to the throne, that he was the son of Asa, which gave him direct ascendancy to the throne. And he began to reign over Judah in the 4th year of Ahab, the king of Israel. So that tells us the time factor. The 4th year of King Ahab sets the tone for us, and when he began to reign. And in verse 42 we see his age. Jehoshaphat was 35 years old when he began to reign. And that tells us he was already a mature man. He wasn't some little kid that got put on the throne earlier. He was a man who had reached maturity and had gained some wisdom over the years. He lived long enough to gain information that he would need for his life, as any man would, reaching the age of 35. And we see his tenure, that he reigned 25 years in Jerusalem. Jerusalem being the capital of the southern kingdom of Judah. That gave him enough time to do both much good and much evil. His ancestry, we'd already seen that he was the son of Asa. Here in the end of verse 42, and his mother's name was Azubah, the daughter of Shehili. His father Asa was one of the great reformers in Judah, and he had a strong influence upon his son Jehoshaphat. We shall see this as the study of his life begins to unfold. But we shall also see that his mother, Azubah, a word in Hebrew which means forsaken or heaped into ruins, which is an appropriate name for her because of her influence on Jehoshaphat's flirting with worldliness, which almost brought his reign to heaps of ruin. Now, in this so far we have seen, we have come to the resumption of the history of Judah, the southern part of that kingdom that had been divided. That study had ended back in chapter 15, verse 24, when we studied the accession of Jehoshaphat as it was first mentioned. His rule over Judah, we see, was both for good and for evil. In verse 43, we read this, and he walked in all the ways of his father, of Asa his father. He turned not aside from it, doing that which was right in the eyes of Jehovah. That's a real blessing. That's something that is never said about the kings in the north, the kings of Israel, the northern half of the kingdom. That's only said of those who reigned in the southern half, did that which was right in the eyes of Jehovah. Now, to do that which was right in the eyes of Jehovah is a mark of spiritual maturity and dedication and determination to serve God. And Jehoshaphat manifested that. He walked in the ways of his father, and he also walked in the ways of Jehovah. So we have a good heritage from his father and a good direction for his life from Jehovah, the God of Israel. So that was all for good. But sadly, his reign was marked by things that he did for evil. Verse 43, middle of the verse, the high places were not taken away. The people still offered burnt incense in the high places, and Jehoshaphat made peace with Ahab, the king of Israel. So what we see here is that he kept the idolatrous places in the nation. Rather than destroying them, as his father had begun to do, he did not carry that on. He left the idolatrous places and he forwarded the idolatrous practices, because the people yet burned incense in their high places where they worshiped the idols. Now that's a bad mark against him. When you read that he did that which was right in the eyes of Jehovah, and the next thing you see is this, it's meant for a very stark contrast to be drawn and to pay attention to it. But we see something else about this man in verse 44, that he made peace with the king of Israel. Now, Jehoshaphat was a good king, for the most part, one who did that which was right in the eyes of Jehovah, for the most part. But that does not mean that he never did anything wrong. His attitude and attraction with worldly acclaim, as seen in his alliance with Ahab, was most certainly a very serious and grievous mistake. I want you to turn over to 2 Chronicles just for a moment. 2 Chronicles chapter 19. Verse 1, Jehoshaphat the king of Judah returned to his house in peace to Jerusalem, and Jehu the son of Hanani the seer went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the ungodly and love them that hate the Lord? Therefore wrath is upon you from before the Lord. Nevertheless, there are good things found in you, in that you have taken away the groves out of the land, and has prepared thine heart to seek God. So there was both good and evil, and one of the things that were considered evil was that he made peace with Ahab, who hated God, hated the people of God, hated the things of God, and Jehoshaphat entered into a covenant of peace with him. Politically, that may have been viewed as something good, but in the eyes of God, it was not good. And he sent a prophet to tell Jehoshaphat that. His record, as we see in our text in verse 45, and the rest of the acts of Jehoshaphat in his might that he showed, and how he warred, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? Well, yes, they are. The book of the Chronicles is 4 chapters dedicated to him. The specific acts of his reign begin to be unfolded in verse 46. And the remnant, or the rest of the Sodomites, who remained in the days of his father Asa, he removed from the land. Now, the first thing that we see about the specific acts of his reign that God records has to do with the Sodomites. Here we see evidence of his walking in the ways of his father, because his father Asa was the first one to take this cause up and to rid the land of them. But he did not get rid of all of them. So it says, but the rest of them who remained, Jehoshaphat removed from the land. So the work of his father was of a great value to Jehoshaphat, since Asa's ways were the ways of righteousness. And thus Jehoshaphat completed the work started by his father. The rest of the Sodomites he removed from the land. Now the Hebrew word removed is also translated exterminated in other places, and I think that should be included here in our thoughts of they were removed from the land by being exterminated. He didn't just, give them a bus ticket and tell them get out of town. Under the reigns of Rehoboam and Abijam and those who had preceded him, homosexuals and homosexualism had found acceptance and protection, just as they are in our day, in our land. It may be politically correct to accept them, but God just does not. Today, Asa and Jehoshaphat would be denounced and vilified for what they did. They'd be held up to public ridicule. Much space in newspapers and news reports would be made against them. They would be made objects of scorn, disgust. And that would come from our president on down. For even thinking of taking such an action. Because now in our land you cannot even think what you do or give even a little expression of it without you being caught by the thought police of our land. But Jehoshaphat carried on the work of his father and rid the land of the Sodomites. But that's not all he did. We see in verse 47, and there was no king in Edom. A deputy was king. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that Jehoshaphat was active in doing the things of God, walking according to the ways of God in his dealing with the Edomites. The Edomites were descendants of Esau and were long-standing enemies of the people of God. We see here that they were effectively subjugated by Jehoshaphat, which is why they had no king. They were run over and controlled by Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat appointed a deputy king, a deputy ruler to rule over the Edomites, and thus did another thing considered inhumane in our land today. He was protecting his borders. And he didn't care whether the Edomites liked it or not. There's another thing about the specific acts of Jehoshaphat that were given here, verses 48 and 49, we see his acts as concerning Ahaziah in Israel. Verse 48, Jehoshaphat made ships of Tarshish to go to Ophir for gold, but they did not go because the ships were broken up at Ezion-Geber. Then Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, said to Jehoshaphat, Let my servants go with your servants in the ships. But Jehovah was not willing. Jehoshaphat seems to have had a hard time learning certain lessons as he entered into yet another alliance with the house of Ahab. In 2 Kings chapter 18, we're told that Jehoram, Jehoshaphat's son, married Athaliah, Ahab's daughter, which brought the two families together. Jehoshaphat thought that would strengthen his reign, but it almost brought it to ruin. His friendship with Ahab carried over to a friendship with Ahaziah, who walked in the ways of his father Ahab. And if that wasn't bad enough, he also walked in the ways of his mother Jezebel. We see this in verses 51 and following. Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, reigned over Israel in Samaria the 17th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Israel, reigned over it. And he did that which was evil in the eyes of Jehovah, and walked in the ways of his father and in the ways of his mother. Yet Jehoshaphat had entered into a trade alliance with Ahaziah. And they began fitting out a fleet of ships at the port of Ezion-Geber on the northern tip of the Gulf of Aqaba on the Red Sea to sail to Ophir, noted for its fine gold. But God rebuked him for that and destroyed the ships as they sat in the port, as we see in verse 49. Let my servants go with your ships, but rather in verse 48. But they went not, because the ships were broken up in Ezion-Geber. That was God's judgment upon Jehoshaphat entering into that alliance and destroying the ships that they were making in order to go on this joint venture together. Again, Jehoshaphat had to learn the hard way, but he did learn. For when Ahaziah wanted to renew the venture by saying, well, look, okay, let my servants go with your servants, and we'll do it anyway. We'll go down there and get the gold anyway. Jehoshaphat said, no, I'm not willing to do that. He learned his lesson. And in verse 50, we come to the death of Jehoshaphat. And Jehoshaphat rested with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David his father, and Jehoram his son reigned in his place. Jehoshaphat went the ways of all flesh. He died. He had done mostly good, but he'd done some bad, but God allowed him to reign for a long period of time, and then he died, and he rested. Your English text may say slept, but either way, the word is very descriptive. This is what is often read concerning a man whose ways are pleasing to God. They don't just die in death. They're not suffering, and they rest in the Lord. They sleep. Paul speaks of it in his letter to the Corinthians about those who sleep in death. And that's what we do as believers. We go to sleep in the Lord, and it's not a matter of a terrifying event. And Jehoshaphat rested, or he slept with his fathers, and was buried with his fathers in the city of David, who was his great progenitor. And his son Jehoram reigned in his place. Now, beloved, this is but a short version of the much larger section of information we have from 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles concerning Jehoshaphat. But like I said, we're going to confine our study here to these few verses. It's a sad fact that there are today far too many Jehoshaphat's among the people of God. Those who are eager to compromise their testimony of being a Christian for the sake of social acceptance or worldly riches or whatever. Jehoshaphat wanted worldly riches. He liked worldly acclaim. He sought to expand his presence, even entering into covenants and agreements and contracts with the ungodly. One of the sad things, and of how Christians can compromise their testimony, and it's becoming more and more prevalent today. And I'm not trying to take away their salvation, I'm just stating the facts. That marrying an ungodly person for whatever reason can only bring the believer years of pain and sorrow. And no blessings from God shall ever be upon that marriage. Why? Because it's forbidden by God. I didn't make that law. God did. And no Christian should let the consideration of money, like the gold of Ophir, ever lead them into seeking a venture of any kind with the ungodly. Paul tells us we're not to have any kind of connection with the ungodly. Be not unequally yoked together with the unbelieving. That doesn't mean in marriage, how most people take it, but it means in any kind of situation, marriage or business or anything else. Now that doesn't mean that as a Christian you can't work for a corporation that the president is not saved. That doesn't mean that. This is speaking of personally yoking yourself with an individual in business or whatever kind of contract would be appropriate to be considered. Putting your money into a venture with the ungodly is not a wise thing to do. It just cannot work unless the Christian compromises his testimony and assumes the attitude of the ungodly. Then you can work well together. Now, you've all heard my testimony of the creed of business in this world. I love doing business with an honest man because I can cheat him without having to worry about him cheating me. And whether anybody likes that fact or not, it's the truth. And the only way that a godly person can make it by becoming in a venture with the ungodly is to be like the ungodly. Otherwise it won't work. You have to compromise your Christian testimony. It may mean that, hey, listen, we've got a big contract coming up and the people that want, they like to go to strip shows, so you take them out, you and your wife take them out to the strip joint and entertain our clients. Well, if you're in it for money, then you'll do it. You've compromised your testimony. That's why it can't work. Only in worldly, ungodly ways can such a thing prosper. And it results in the loss of all godly blessings. Now, we're always being tempted by such money-making ventures. And sadly, many have fallen into the enticing trap. I think we all remember, and I don't say this out of anything other than as an illustration of God's protection. Our sister, Margaret Hargrave, many years ago, got a form letter from Reader's Digest. Said, you may have won $50,000 or $1 million. That's what it was. She misread it and thought that she had won $1 million. She came to me and Bob and said, I don't want $1 million. We tried to explain it to her. I know, but I don't want $1 million, and I'm going to write. And they had this Carolyn Davis, a machine that signs these things. I'm going to write Carolyn Davis and tell her to keep the money. Margaret, you don't have any money. They're not sending you any money. Now, the protection of God in that is that I do not want, I don't care even if I have it, I don't want it. That's the protection of God. Apart from that, a believer could be taken in by that kind of scheme. And you'll wind up buying Reader's Digest magazine from Natalie Who Shot John, which is exactly what they want. You cannot enter into any business, money-making venture with the ungodly and expect a blessing from it. I was particularly blessed in my counseling with Margaret and with Bob also as we ministered to her about that. I said, Margaret, if you got $1 million, if they sent it to you anyway, what would you do with it? She said, I'd send it back. Because I don't want it to be a temptation to me. I'm happy the way I am. Because the temptation is there. That godly woman would not stand for that. It took Bob and me weeks and weeks to finally convince her that it was all a scam and not to worry about it. But we're always being tempted, beloved. As the people of God, we're always being tempted. Like Jehoshaphat, who walked in the ways of the Lord, was always being tempted by Ahab or some money-making scheme. The gold of Ophir, going into the shipbuilding business, going this or that. For the sake of becoming well known, liked by the ungodly. Getting your picture in the paper or on a magazine or whatever. Like I say, sadly, many have fallen into that enticing trap, but like Jehoshaphat, he finally did learn the lesson. We must also learn that if we've once fallen, to never repeat that sin of unequally yoking ourselves together with unbelievers. That passage in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, 14 and following is very important for our Christian life. And you need to study it again and again and again and keep it before you. We have no thing in common with them. And we should stay away from them as much as we possibly can. Because they're only out to do us harm, to ruin our testimony. Ahab pulled Jehoshaphat down. He had to learn the lesson a hard way. We'll find out more about that in our studies of him coming on. But the grace of God was sufficient to protect him, and the grace of God is sufficient to protect us. We're about to receive the bread and the cup this morning. And what it says to us is what we see here in our passage about walking in the ways of God, our Lord Jesus. By receiving the bread and the cup, we are announcing before him and before ourselves and before one another that we are in a right standing with God. We're not being double-tongued or two-faced. We're living in a manner of having acknowledged our sin and being cleansed of them, so that we can walk in fellowship with him. And may the Lord bless us in the doing of that. Let's close down a word of prayer. Almighty God,